At 11:51 at night, the executive notification illuminated my dark office. The audit is complete. Your management authority over the coastal portfolio has been transferred. Seconds later, my son-in-law, Julian, hearted the notification in our family group chat. I am a 68-year-old retired master botanist in Mendocino County, and I did not weep. Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. I simply picked up my secure line, contacted my private wealth manager, and initiated a hard freeze on every shared corporate account. The silence in the coastal house had deepened over the quiet months following the passing of my wife, Margaret. Without her steady presence, the operational architecture of our family began to shift in ways that were entirely predictable. Julian Vance Cole, a slick corporate land acquisition strategist who had married my daughter Jocelyn 9 years prior, immediately positioned himself to absorb our $28 million coastal property portfolio. He was a man who only made solid eye contact when he was calculating your net worth. The early years of their marriage were an exercise in performative respect. But grief creates a vacuum, and Julian saw my mourning not as a tragedy, but as a logistical inconvenience to be managed for his own liquidity. Supported by his mother, Beatrice, a former title insurance executive with a predatory instinct for vulnerable assets, Julian began treating my life's work as a depreciating asset. I would sit across from them at dinner, listening to Beatrice quietly catalog our heritage acreage, while Julian made suggestions about simplifying my estate. My botanical expertise, honed over 4 decades of preserving the misty, cliffside redwood groves, meant nothing to him. In rooms full of younger developers, he would wave his hand dismissively and call me mom-in-law, a title he weaponized strictly to highlight my age and diminish my authority. He told anyone who would listen that I was losing my grasp on the modern market. Jocelyn simply looked away, folding her hands, and remaining a passive accomplice to her husband's corporate greed. I had quietly funded her architectural firm and maintained the Redwood Trust when financial storms threatened their horizon, yet I was now being marginalized as an aging obstacle. I watched the psychological erosion happen in real time. What people often misunderstand is that elder financial abuse and psychological marginalization within families rarely start with overt malice. They begin with small, rationalized boundary violations that are excused as practical planning. This is the psychology of instrumental entitlement. Toxic individuals do not view aging relatives as human beings with autonomy, agency, or inherent value. They view them as depreciating capital. When adult children and in-laws begin treating an aging parent's independence as a logistical hurdle that must be overcome to secure their own financial future, they reveal a profound moral bankruptcy. They use the natural vulnerability of grief as an opening to insert themselves into the financial hierarchy. Julian and Beatrice were not acting out of concern for my well-being. They were simply executing a hostile takeover disguised as familial duty. I realized then that family affection had become a business transaction. I had been the silent investor in their version of a family, and now they were attempting a corporate buyout of my life. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret for what I was about to do. But there was only absolute clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. And they had vastly underestimated the meticulous nature of a woman who had spent her entire life studying the deep, unyielding roots of ancient trees. The digital locks engaged one by one as I revoked their access to my capital. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt like an auditor correcting a prolonged accounting error. To understand the sheer audacity of Julian's attempted takeover, you have to understand the ledger of our shared history. Over the past decade, I had been the silent financial anchor, keeping their extravagant lifestyle afloat. When Julian's speculative real estate ventures collapsed, leaving him and Jocelyn staring down the barrel of foreclosure on 3 separate occasions, it was my signature on the notarized checks that rescued them. I had quietly pumped $360,000 annually into Jocelyn's business development, ensuring her architectural firm remained solvent, while her husband played corporate titan. I paid the property taxes. I maintained the historic maritime timber framing restoration yard. Most importantly, I single-handedly preserved the strict redwood conservation covenant that protected our coastal holding from commercial exploitation. They had spent years building their polished corporate success on a foundation entirely financed by the woman they were now trying to discard. Decades of unacknowledged sacrifice sat neatly in my filing cabinets, meticulously recorded in black ink. Yet, in their minds, I had outlived my usefulness. The uncomfortable truth is that blood relation is frequently weaponized as an emotional shackle to force compliance with exploitation. Society demands that we forgive family, that we seek harmony, that we keep the peace at all costs. But forcing reconciliation with relatives who treat your existence as a barrier to their inheritance is not noble. It is a form of self-destruction. This is the sanctuary of quiet boundaries. True health often requires a cold, unyielding amputation of toxic ties. Most people would excuse Julian's behavior as ambitious or urge me to compromise with my daughter for the sake of the family unit. But an undeniable psychological release occurs when you recognize that a relationship built on entitlement is entirely beyond repair. When people show you that they view your generosity as a weakness to be exploited, the most dignified response is absolute emotional detachment combined with airtight legal execution. I stopped making their excuses. The wedding dress Jocelyn wore, paid for by Margaret and me, was still hanging in a preservation box in the guest room. I looked at it and felt nothing. Love had been a subscription, and I was officially footing the bill for a service that no longer delivered value. I had given them every opportunity to be family, but they had chosen to be adversaries. My righteous anger was cold and methodical. They were not shocked by their own greed. They were simply about to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. The financial lines were severed. The corporate credit cards were frozen. The joint accounts were locked. Within 12 minutes of Julian's midnight notification, I had executed a total asset freeze. I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of water, listening to the distant crash of the waves against the Mendocino cliffs. The storm they had invited was finally here, and I was entirely prepared to let it wash them away. The retaliation from their side did not begin with apologies or sudden moments of clarity. It began with the frantic, toxic escalation of people who suddenly find their corporate credit lines severed. My phone screen lit up repeatedly as the harsh reality of my financial freeze set in. Julian did not ask what was wrong or request a conversation. Instead, he sent a series of condescending voice memos, demanding an immediate reinstatement of his corporate privileges. He spoke with the practiced patience of a man explaining basic arithmetic to a child, stating that I was confused and overreacting to standard estate auditing procedures. When I did not respond, his tone shifted abruptly from patronizing to openly threatening, warning me that my interference was jeopardizing crucial commercial acquisitions that he had spent months orchestrating. Jocelyn, my own daughter, texted me paragraphs of emotional manipulation. She claimed I was luring myself into isolation and ruining our family unity, weaponizing the memory of her mother to induce guilt. She insisted that Julian was only trying to protect our legacy and that my actions were unnecessarily vindictive. She painted herself as the victim of my sudden cruelty. But the most calculated strike came from Beatrice. Recognizing that financial control required discrediting my authority, she utilized her extensive professional networks to coordinate a public social media smear campaign. She began planting quiet, insidious rumors among our community and corporate partners. Beatrice posted vaguely concerned messages about the tragedy of cognitive decline in the elderly, strongly hinting that I was suffering from severe dementia and paranoia following Margaret's death. She suggested that my sudden withdrawal of family funds was a tragic symptom of a deteriorating mind. This unremitting toxicity completely stripped away any remaining fragment of sympathy I might have harbored. They were not just ungrateful, they were actively attempting to destroy my professional reputation, to steal my assets. I watched their digital assault unfold with clinical detachment. Every threatening voice memo Julian sent, every manipulative text from Jocelyn, every slanderous post curated by Beatrice was downloaded, categorized, and filed securely away. They believed they were isolating me, painting me as a fragile, confused widow who needed to be institutionalized for her own good. In reality, they were systematically providing me with the exact ammunition I needed to eradicate them from my life. They were constantly proving they had absolutely no remorse. This was no longer a family dispute. It was a character assassination designed to facilitate theft. I didn't cry. I didn't draft an emotional defense on social media. I didn't reach out to mutual friends to clear my name. Anger is a complete waste of energy compared to cold, clear understanding. Their public gaslighting greenlit my full legal mobilization. They wanted to treat my life as a hostile corporate takeover. I was perfectly willing to engage them on those exact terms. The misty morning air rolled in off the cliffs, chilling the windows of my study. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, arranged the printed transcripts of their threats on my desk, and picked up the phone. It was time to shift from emotional containment to professional prosecution. I placed a call to Marcus Sterling. Marcus was a brilliant Heritage Trust attorney whose sprawling office overlooked the rugged Mendocino coastline. I had retained his services quietly several months earlier, sensing the gathering storm in Julian's increasingly aggressive inquiries about my estate management. I had learned from decades of studying fragile botanical ecosystems that survival depends on anticipating the shift in the weather long before the rain actually begins to fall. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice calm and anchored. I did not offer pleasantries or emotional venting. I simply told him they had made their move, and it was time to deploy the legal armor we had meticulously constructed. I drove to his sterile, elegant downtown office, handing over the massive digital dossier of Julian's voice memos, Jocelyn's texts, and Beatrice's defamatory social media posts. Marcus reviewed the materials with the cold precision of a forensic surgeon. He noted that their entire strategy relied on manufacturing a narrative of my incompetence, a flimsy narrative that would absolutely shatter against the airtight legal reality of our foundational documents. We transitioned instantly from personal drama to systemic legal warfare. Marcus drafted a formal executive notice of cease and desist. The language was sterile, uncompromising, and absolutely devastating. It formally notified Julian Vance Cole that he had exactly 30 days to reverse all unauthorized corporate maneuvering and cease his fraudulent claims against the coastal estate, or federal asset recovery protocols would be immediately triggered. It detailed the exact statutes he was violating and explicitly referenced the Redwood Conservation Covenant that legally locked him out of any administrative control over the heritage acreage. There was no emotion in the document, no familial hedging, no intimate, no room for interpretation. It was a formal declaration of corporate war. When Marcus dispatched the notice via certified courier to Julian's high-end corporate trust offices, the dynamic of the conflict irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the grieving widow defending her home. I was the sovereign trustee executing her absolute legal authority. A few days later, Julian's attorney retaliated with a hollow legal filing, attempting to challenge my administrative capacity based on Beatrice's fabricated rumors of my cognitive decline. They hoped to drag the case through months of agonizing court delays, betting that I would grow exhausted and surrender a portion of the estate just to buy peace. They assumed my age equated to fatigue. They were fundamentally incorrect. I stood on the deck of my restored maritime timber framing restoration yard, inhaling the sharp scent of pine and salt. I watched my crew carefully sanding the hull of a century-old vessel. Building something enduring requires infinite patience, a quality Julian entirely lacked. I called Marcus and told him to proceed with the comprehensive forensic audit of Julian's own corporate entities. If Julian wanted to weaponize the legal system to scrutinize my mental fitness, I was going to employ that same system to dismantle his entire professional existence, brick by brick. The legal armor was firmly in place, and the trap was perfectly set. We only needed to wait for him to make the fatal mistake of stepping further into it. Just when Julian believed he could successfully stall the proceedings through endless court delays and bureaucratic friction, Marcus Sterling uncovered a devastating criminal layer beneath the polished veneer of Julian's career. This is the kill shot. The moment the conflict transcends a civil inheritance dispute and enters the realm of absolute moral and legal invalidation, Marcus requested an urgent meeting at his office. When I arrived, he did not offer a greeting. He simply slid a thick, confidential forensic audit across the table. I opened the file. Over the past 4 years, Julian had been systematically and quietly skimming capital from his own client acquisition trusts. He ran their earnest deposit money through a sophisticated network of digital transfers, taking massive cuts disguised as consulting fees. Marcus traced the digital metadata, revealing that Julian had funneled over $720,000 through a dummy shell corporation, securely registered in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the banking ledgers, the offshore wire transfers, and the fabricated invoices. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. Julian's entire persona, the luxury suits, the arrogant confidence, the condescending lectures about my outdated understanding of the market, was built entirely on theft and deception. He was not a corporate titan. He was a common embezzler. Marcus explained that Julian's paper trail was clever enough to bypass casual scrutiny, but it was moments away from completely collapsing under the weight of a federal investigation. This was the twist that removed any remaining path to redemption. Julian and Beatrice weren't simply ungrateful relatives suffering from a toxic sense of entitlement. They were active criminals whose greed had crossed into federal jurisdiction. If we submitted these findings to the state licensing board and the federal financial regulators, Julian would face immediate revocation of his broker's license and federal indictment. I felt a cold, sharp sense of satisfaction settle into my bones. There would be no compromises. There would be no mediated settlements. Julian had handed me the exact instrument of his own destruction. Marcus asked if I wanted to forward the dossier to the authorities immediately. I looked out the window at the dense, mist-laden pine forests in the distance. "No," I said, my voice steady and transactional. "We don't use it yet. Timing is everything. If we expose him now, it looks like a desperate retaliatory strike to save the estate. We let him believe he is winning. We let him walk into the formal executive estate audit, wearing his arrogance like a crown. We let him commit to his own narrative completely. We will wait until he demands the entire $28 million portfolio to his face, and then we will execute the sequence." I left the offshore ledger locked in Marcus's secure vault. Winter had settled into the coastal groves, bringing a biting chill to the air. But inside me, a clinical, calculating fire was burning. The accounting was nearly finished, and it was almost time to present Julian with his final, devastating invoice. I walked out of the law office feeling a profound sense of clarity. The family I had grieved was a fiction. The man trying to ruin me was a fraud. And the justice I was about to deliver would be absolute. The narrative reached its absolute peak during the formal executive estate audit, held in the imposing mahogany boardroom of Marcus Sterling's offices. The heavy double doors swung open, and Julian arrived flanked by his mother, Beatrice. Julian wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and the absolute confidence of a predator who expects total, unquestioned victory. Beatrice carried her designer portfolio tightly, a slight, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. Jocelyn followed closely behind them, taking a seat at the far end of the long table, remaining entirely silent with her eyes downcast. She had chosen her side. Julian claimed the leather chair closest to the head of the table, immediately taking control of the room's energy. He didn't even wait for Marcus to finish opening the preliminary documents. Julian leaned forward, planting his hands flat on the polished wood, and attempted to interrupt the proceedings with his usual practiced arrogance. "We already know the structure of this transition," Julian barked, his voice carrying the sharp edge of manufactured authority. "The entire $28 million coastal estate, along with the heritage acreage, belongs to Jocelyn and me. We've already picked out a nice, quiet memory care facility for you, Evelyn. You're done." Beatrice made a small, approving sound in the back of her throat. I remained entirely silent. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at the man who had spent the last 9 years treating me as a depreciating asset, and I felt nothing but a cold, absolute finality. The room seemed to hold its breath. I slowly reached into my leather satchel. I pulled out a cream-colored binder, boldly labeled Redwood Conservation Trust. I placed it on the table. Beside it, I placed the thick, red-tabbed federal embezzlement dossier detailing the Cayman Islands wire transfers. I slid both folders across the smooth mahogany surface until they rested exactly inches from Julian's fingertips. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping to a quiet, chilling whisper. "You really don't know, do you?" Julian's confident smirk faltered. He opened the cream-colored binder first. Marcus calmly explained that while Julian had successfully hijacked the Superficial Management LLC, Margaret and I had executed an irrevocable generational trust years prior, legally locking the actual property deeds into the conservation covenant. It bypassed probate entirely. The estate was completely untouchable. Julian's face began to drain of color. His hands shook slightly as he opened the second folder. I watched his eyes track over the offshore banking ledgers, the stolen client funds, the documented proof of his $720,000 embezzlement scheme. The reality of his total, inescapable ruin crashed down upon him in real time. Beatrice leaned over to look at the documents, and I watched her knuckles turn completely white as she realized her son's crimes had just exposed their entire family to federal indictment. The arrogant predator had suddenly become the prey. Julian froze, unable to speak, breathe, or look away from the papers that sealed his fate. The reversal of power was absolute. The collapse of Julian's empire was silent and instantaneous. Trapped by the incontrovertible proof of his offshore embezzlement, he was given exactly one option. Under the immediate, crushing threat of federal prosecution, Julian signed an unconditional withdrawal of all legal claims against my estate. The paperwork was executed before he even left the boardroom, his hands shaking visibly as he surrendered his manufactured kingdom. Jocelyn, finally recognizing the catastrophic depth of Julian's betrayal and the severe reality of his financial crimes, contacted a high-powered divorce attorney that very afternoon. She moved out of their shared corporate townhouse the very next morning, realizing her complicity had cost her everything. Beatrice's former title firm distanced itself entirely, cutting all professional ties with Julian and issuing public statements to avoid the impending federal fallout that would inevitably consume his career. The $28 million coastal estate remained fully and completely under my control, untouched by their calculating greed. I utilized the preserved capital to fully fund my heritage maritime restoration yard, ensuring that the redwood canopy and the misty Mendocino cliffs would be protected and nurtured for generations to come. Weeks later, I stood at the helm of my newly restored timber vessel, listening to the rhythmic hum of the engine. I steered her out past the jagged Mendocino coastline, eventually cutting the engine to let the boat drift into the open, sunlit water. The sea was perfectly calm, the salty air sharp and remarkably clean. For the first time in a very long time, I breathed freely. I've come to realize that the most profound deceptions often hide behind the mask of familial duty. Blood relation is frequently weaponized as an emotional shackle, a manipulative tool to enforce compliance with elder exploitation. We are socially conditioned to endure toxic behavior in the name of family harmony, told to shrink ourselves so that entitled relatives can comfortably expand their greed. But forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. True peace does not come from forced reconciliation with those who view you as a depreciating resource to be plundered. It stems from the establishment of unshakable personal boundaries and the cold, unyielding courage to protect exactly what you have built. I did not seek revenge, I sought accounting, and in balancing the ledger, I finally reclaimed my absolute sovereignty. If this story of quiet resilience resonated with you, drop a comment below, sharing your thoughts. Hit subscribe, and stay with us for more stories about boundaries, patience, and true justice.